There's a particular kind of vulnerability that comes with having everything to lose. The wealthy understand this better than anyone, which is why they've always been willing to pay enormous sums to keep their secrets buried in the glittering ballrooms of Gilded Age New York, where fortunes were displayed like military medals and reputations were more valuable than gold. A shadow industry flourished, an organized system of extortion so sophisticated, so profitable, that it operated almost as openly as the banks themselves. Before we dive into this dark world of systematic blackmail and financial destruction, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is the kind of story they don't teach in history class. The kind that reveals how power really operates and how the wealthy have always been the easiest marks for those who understand their vulnerabilities. Turn on notifications because we're exposing the scandals that shaped America's most corrupt era, one devastating story at a time, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. This is the story of how America's wealthiest men became prey, how their moral failings were weaponized against them, and how one particular scandal, involving Edwin Post, husband of the woman who would become America's etiquette authority, exposed an entire criminal ecosystem built on shame, secrecy, and the desperate need to maintain respectability. But this isn't just about one man's downfall. It's about understanding how extortion became an industry, how criminals developed systems to identify, trap, and milk wealthy victims for decades, and how the very structure of Gilded Age society, with its obsession with appearance and terror of scandal, created the perfect conditions for this parasitic economy to thrive. The year was 1899 and New York City was drowning in money. The Gilded Age had reached its apex. Vanderbilts and Astors competed to build more ostentatious mansions. J.P. Morgan was consolidating industries, creating monopolies that would define American capitalism for generations. Carnegie was still building his steel empire before his transformation into philanthropist. Wealth was everywhere. Visible, shameless, excessive. But with that wealth came something else. An obsessive concern with reputation. Because these newly rich families understood that money alone didn't guarantee social acceptance. Old New York society, the Knickerbocker families who traced their lineage back to Dutch colonists, looked down on these industrial titans as vulgar upstarts. So reputation became currency, more valuable than gold, more essential than property. Your standing in society determined everything. Who would marry your children? Which clubs would accept you? Which families would receive you? Which business deals would be offered? And anything that threatened that standing, any scandal, any whisper of impropriety, had to be eliminated at any cost. This created the perfect ecosystem for predators. Emily Price Post, born in 1872, would eventually become famous for writing the definitive guide to American manners. Her book Etiquette, published in 1922, would sell millions of copies and establish her as the ultimate authority on proper behavior. Generations of Americans would consult her books before dinner parties, weddings, funerals, any social occasion that required knowing the correct thing to do. The irony is almost too perfect. The woman who taught America how to behave was married to a man whose behavior was so scandalous, so recklessly self-destructive, that it would destroy their marriage, bankrupt their family, and expose an entire criminal industry that had been operating in plain sight for decades. Edwin Post came from old New York money, the kind that didn't need to be discussed because everyone already knew. His family had been prominent since before the Revolution. They'd made their fortune in shipping, diversified into banking and real estate. By the time Edwin was born in 1867, the Post family was worth an estimated $4 million, roughly $120 million in today's currency. He was educated at St. Paul's School, then Harvard. Though he didn't distinguish himself academically, he was more interested in sports, parties, the social aspects of elite education, rather than the intellectual ones. This was not unusual for wealthy young men of his era. They were being groomed not for professional careers, but for managing inherited wealth and maintaining family position. Edwin was handsome, charming in a superficial way, possessed of that particular confidence that comes from never having worried about money. He moved in the highest social circles, belonged to the right clubs, knew the right people. In 1892, at age 25, he married Emily Price, herself from a distinguished family. Her father was the architect Bruce Price, designer of some of New York's most prominent buildings, including the original Hotel Chateau Frontenac in Quebec. The wedding was exactly what society expected. 400 guests at Delmonico's, the most exclusive restaurant in New York. Coverage in all the society pages. A honeymoon in Europe lasting 3 months. Emily was 19, educated, accomplished, raised to be the perfect wife for a man of Edwin's class. She spoke French fluently, played piano beautifully, understood the complex rules of social etiquette that governed their world. On paper, It was an ideal match. Old money marrying old money. Social positions secured on both sides, their children would inherit not just wealth but legitimacy. That ineffable quality that separated the truly elite from the merely rich but beneath the polished surface. Edwin had problems. Problems that were common among men of his class and generation. Problems that would make him the perfect target for the criminal network that was watching. Waiting, cataloging his weaknesses, he gambled, not casually but compulsively. Cards, horses, dice, anything that offered the illusion of risk. Without actual consequence, he would lose thousands in a single night, then laugh it off. Drawing from his trust fund to cover the debts, he drank heavily, starting before lunch and continuing through the evening. Functioning but perpetually impaired, making decisions with judgment clouded by alcohol, and he had an appetite for women that his marriage vows did nothing to diminish. Actresses, dancers, women of negotiable virtue, he pursued them with the same reckless abandon he brought to gambling. Emily knew, of course, wives always knew, but women of her class were expected to maintain appearances, to ignore their husbands' indiscretions as long as they remained discreet, and for the first few years of marriage, Edwin was discreet enough. His affairs were conducted quietly. His gambling happened in private clubs. His drinking was socially acceptable excess rather than obvious alcoholism. But by 1898, he was becoming careless, staying out later, coming home drunker, spending money more freely, accumulating debts that even his trust fund struggled to cover. He was, in the terminology of professional ripe. These weaknesses, individually, were manageable. Collectively, they made Edwin Post exactly the kind of target that the shadow industry of social blackmail dreamed of finding. Wealthy enough to pay, reckless enough to be compromised, vain enough to value reputation above almost everything. And in the winter of 1899, that industry would spring its trap with devastating precision. By the late 1890s, organized blackmail in New York had evolved from opportunistic crime into systematic business. This wasn't a few isolated criminals taking advantage of unfortunate circumstances. This was an industry with infrastructure, specialization, standard operating procedures. There were networks of operatives spanning the city, each person playing a specific role in a well-rehearsed performance. Scouts who identified vulnerable marks, lures who created compromising situations, witnesses who provided corroboration, lawyers who negotiated payments, enforcers who ensured cooperation. At the center of this network in Lower Manhattan was an organization that didn't have an official name because official names attract attention. Those who knew about it simply called it the syndicate, and it operated with the efficiency of any successful business. The syndicate maintained what they called the book, a constantly updated ledger of wealthy men and their vulnerabilities. This wasn't a simple list. It was a comprehensive database containing everything a criminal needed to know to successfully extract money from a target. Family background, to understand what kind of scandal would be most damaging. Estimated liquid wealth, to know how much could be extracted. Known vices, to identify points of leverage. Previous scandals, to gauge risk tolerance. Strength of marriage, to determine how much a man would pay to keep his wife from finding out. Social position, to calculate how much reputation was worth. The book was maintained by a man named Abraham Rothstein. He ran a legitimate business as an insurance broker, which gave him access to financial information about New York's wealthiest families. But his real income came from the syndicate, where he served as chief strategist. Rothstein was brilliant, methodical, patient. He understood that successful extortion required careful planning. You didn't just grab a wealthy man and demand money. You built a case, created unassailable evidence, positioned yourself so the victim had no option but to pay. Edwin Post entered the book in 1895, when he was first observed at an illegal gambling house on West 44th Street, called the Metropole Club. The initial notation beside his name read, Edwin M. Post, age 28, Harvard, 1889. Married to Emily Price, Post, 1892. 2 sons, family worth estimated $4 million. Trust fund provides $25,000 annually. Known weaknesses: cards and horses gambling, daily heavy alcohol, women woe-eretencers, actresses, prostitutes. Assessment: wealthy, reckless, weak marriage, gambling problem, excellent prospect. Recommendation: observe for 18 to 24 months before approach. For years, Edwin was watched. His patterns were documented. His weaknesses were cataloged. Syndicate operatives tracked which gambling houses he frequented, which women caught his attention, how much he typically lost in an evening, how drunk he got before his judgment completely failed. They noted that he gambled most heavily on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that he preferred poker to other card games, that he was attracted to brunettes with theatrical flair. that he became belligerent when drunk but malleable when caught between drunkenness and sobriety. This information was valuable because it allowed the syndicate to design a trap specifically calibrated to Edwin's vulnerabilities. This wasn't random. It was targeted, personalized, engineered for maximum effectiveness. By early 1899, Rothstein decided Edwin was ready. He had accumulated enough debt that he was feeling financial pressure. His marriage had deteriorated to the point where Emily was spending more time at her father's house. He was drinking more heavily and gambling more recklessly. He was prime. The operation that would ensnare Edwin Post began with careful preparation. First, they needed a location. The syndicate operated several establishments that served as honey traps, legitimate businesses on the surface but designed specifically for creating compromising situations. The primary location was the Saratoga Club, a private gambling establishment on West 31st Street that catered to wealthy men. The club was owned through various shell companies and intermediaries by a man named Charles Mortimer. Mortimer was 43 years old, a former actor who had discovered that criminal enterprise was more profitable than theater. He had the perfect temperament for running a honey trap, charming enough to make wealthy men comfortable, ruthless enough to exploit them without hesitation. The Saratoga Club appeared to be a legitimate, if illegal, gambling operation. Wealthy men came, played cards, won or lost money, drank excellent whiskey, smoked fine cigars, and went home. But certain tables were special. Certain dealers were not what they seemed. Certain rooms had peepholes behind paintings. Certain doors could be opened at precisely the right moment. The club was a theater, and every element was designed for one purpose: creating evidence that could be used to extract money. Edwin Post had been a regular at the Saratoga Club since 1897. He came 2 or 3 times a week, usually losing more than he won, accumulating debts that he paid from his trust fund. He was comfortable there, felt safe, believed he was among gentlemen who understood discretion. This comfort was essential because men who feel threatened don't let their guard down. The trap only works if the mark believes he's safe. In February 1899, a new dealer appeared at the club. She was introduced as Marie Laurent, supposedly from Paris, supposedly dealing cards to earn money while her brother handled some unspecified business matters in America. Marie was not French. She was Margaret Lawson from Philadelphia, 32 years old, and she was one of the most successful lures in New York's extortion business. She had been involved in at least 15 successful blackmail operations between 1894 and 1899, extracting a combined total of over $300,000. That's roughly $9 million in today's currency, from wealthy men who'd been foolish enough to trust her. Her role was simple, but required considerable skill. Identify the mark, build attraction, create opportunity for compromise, provide evidence, then disappear while others handled the extraction. She was very, very good at her job. She understood men like Edwin, instinctively knew exactly how to present herself to trigger their interest, how to seem available without appearing desperate, how to create the illusion of genuine connection while remaining completely calculating. Margaret had been carefully selected for Edwin's operation because her physical type matched his preferences. Dark hair, theatrical beauty, sophisticated manner. She was exactly what he found attractive. Her appearance at the club was choreographed to seem accidental. She was dealing at a different table when Edwin arrived on February 7, 1899. He noticed her, immediately asked if she could deal at his table, was told she was assigned elsewhere but perhaps later in the evening. This created anticipation, made her seem slightly unattainable, increased her value in his mind when she finally did deal. At his table around 10 o'clock that evening, Edwin was already several drinks into the night, his judgment impaired but not completely destroyed. The perfect state for building the trap. Margaret was professional, friendly but not flirtatious. She dealt cards efficiently, made pleasant conversation about Paris, asked polite questions about New York. She was presenting herself as a respectable woman in temporarily reduced circumstances, not as someone available for purchase. This distinction was crucial. Edwin had access to prostitutes. He could buy sex whenever he wanted. What Margaret was offering, or seeming to offer, was something different: connection, interest, the possibility of relationship rather than mere transaction. Over the next month, Margaret made herself available to Edwin whenever he came to the club. She dealt at his table, laughed at his jokes, seemed fascinated by his stories about Harvard, about New York society, about his travels in Europe. She carefully calibrated her interest. Available but not too available. Interested but not desperate. She was creating a fantasy. A beautiful woman who seemed to genuinely care about him, who saw him as more than just another wealthy mark. Edwin, whose marriage had become cold and whose self-esteem was damaged by years of being Emily's disappointing husband, responded exactly as the syndicate predicted. He became infatuated. He started coming to the Saratoga Club more frequently. Specifically on nights when Margaret was dealing, he brought her small gifts. Flowers, a book of French poetry, things that seemed romantic, but were actually him investing emotionally in the trap being built around him. By late March, Edwin was completely caught. He thought about Margaret constantly, talked about her two friends at the club, made it clear that he was interested in more than just cards. Margaret, following Rothstein's careful script, resisted at first. She was a respectable woman, she said. She couldn't possibly entertain advances from a married man, but gradually, over carefully orchestrated conversations, she seemed to soften. She told Edwin that she was lonely in America, that her brother was often away on business, that she had no friends in New York, that their conversations at the club were the only pleasant part of her day. This was all calculated to make Edwin feel needed, important, special. He wasn't just another customer. He was someone who mattered to her. On March 24th, after Edwin had won unusually large at cards and was feeling expansive and confident, Margaret suggested, as if the thought had just occurred to her, that they might meet outside the club, somewhere they could talk without the noise and interruption of gambling. This was the crucial moment, the transition from flirtation to compromising situation, the point where the trap became inescapable. Edwin, drunk on attention and convinced of Margaret's genuine affection, agreed immediately. Enthusiastically, they arranged to meet 2 days later. On the evening of March 26th, Margaret gave him an address, a townhouse on East 23rd Street. She said it belonged to Mrs. Florence Ashcroft, a respectable widow who took boarders. They could meet in the parlor there, have some privacy, talk properly. Edwin saw nothing suspicious in this arrangement. Wealthy married men having discreet meetings with attractive women was so common in their social circle as to be almost normal. He assumed this would be the beginning of an affair, one of many he'd conducted over the years, nothing more complicated than that. He had no idea he was walking into the most sophisticated extortion trap in New York, carefully constructed over months, designed specifically to destroy him. The machinery of entrapment was in position. Every roll cast, every line rehearsed, every exit blocked. All that remained was for Edwin Post to arrive, which he did, precisely on time. On the evening of March 26, 1899, the townhouse on East 23rd Street looked entirely respectable from the outside. A well-maintained brownstone in a neighborhood that was no longer fashionable but hadn't yet declined into poverty, the kind of place where a respectable widow might reasonably take in boarders. The address belonged to Mrs. Florence Ashcroft, or at least, that's what the name on the lease said. In reality, Florence Ashcroft was a 48-year-old former brothel keeper who had discovered that extortion was more profitable and less legally risky than prostitution. She had been working with the syndicate since 1893, providing locations for honey traps, playing various roles in the theatrical productions that ensnared wealthy men. She was an accomplished actress, able to portray outraged virtue or sympathetic understanding as the situation required. Her townhouse was designed specifically for this purpose. The parlor where Edwin would meet Margaret had peepholes concealed behind paintings, doors that could be opened silently from the outside, furniture positioned to create clear sightlines for hidden observers. Nothing was left to chance. Every element had been considered, tested, refined through dozens of previous operations. Edwin arrived at 7:30, precisely the time Margaret had specified. He was nervous but excited, wearing a new suit, his hair freshly cut. He'd told Emily he was dining with business associates, a lie so routine neither of them questioned it anymore. Mrs. Ashcroft answered the door herself, playing the role of respectable boarding house proprietor. She was dressed conservatively, her manner proper but welcoming. "You must be Mr. Post," she said. "Miss Laurent mentioned you would be calling. Please come in. She's waiting in the parlor." The interior of the townhouse reinforced the impression of respectability. Good furniture, religious prints on the walls, everything suggesting a proper household. Edwin was shown to the parlor, a comfortable room with a fire burning in the hearth, velvet curtains drawn against the street, 2 chairs positioned intimately close, a small table with wine and glasses already prepared. Margaret rose to greet him. She was dressed beautifully but not provocatively. The image of respectable femininity, her smile was warm, genuine seeming. She took his hands in greeting, a gesture that was affectionate without being overtly sexual. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "I wasn't sure you would. I know this is irregular." "Not at all," Edwin said, already relaxing. "I've been looking forward to this all day." They sat. Margaret poured wine. They talked. About nothing important, about Paris, about New York, about music and theater. The kind of conversation that creates illusion of intimacy. The wine was excellent. Edwin drank 3 glasses in quick succession. What he didn't know was that it had been fortified, not enough to taste different, but enough to ensure his judgment would be thoroughly impaired within the hour. Margaret was following a carefully calibrated script. Rothstein had planned this operation down to the minute. Every phase of the evening designed to move Edwin progressively deeper into compromise after an hour of conversation. Margaret moved from her chair to sit beside Edwin on the sofa. A clear escalation of intimacy. She placed her hand on his arm. While talking, leaned closer, created opportunities for physical contact. Edwin, who had been drinking fortified wine on top of the whiskey he'd consumed before leaving home, was far past the point of caution. He was aroused, confident, convinced that Margaret wanted him as much as he wanted her. He kissed her. She responded, but not too eagerly. Maintaining the fiction that she was a respectable woman, being seduced rather than a professional executing a plan, they were engaged in various stages of intimacy. Edwin's coat off, Margaret's hair becoming disheveled. When the door to the parlor burst open, a man entered, well-dressed, his face a mask of outrage. Behind him, Mrs. Ashcroft, looking shocked and horrified. "What in God's name is happening here?" the man shouted. Edwin, drunk and panicked, scrambled to his feet, tried to straighten his clothing, his mind racing to understand what was happening. The man was Thomas Whitmore, though Edwin didn't know. His name Whitmore was a 40-year-old actor who specialized in these operations. He'd played the outraged brother or husband in at least 20 different extortion schemes, Marie Whitmore said, his voice trembling with theatrical rage. "How could you? In a respectable house? With this married man?" Margaret was crying now, real tears. She'd learned to cry on cue years ago. "I'm sorry, Charles. He said he loved me. He made promises." This was the script shifting. Margaret was no longer the willing participant, but the victim. Seduced by promises she believed. This was crucial because it placed all moral culpability on Edwin. "You made promises to my sister," Whitmore said, advancing on Edwin. "What kind of man are you? You're married, you have children, and you seduce an innocent woman with lies." Edwin tried to speak, to explain, but his alcohol-soaked brain couldn't form coherent arguments. We were just, this isn't what it looks like. It looks exactly like what it is," Mrs. Ashcroft said, her voice cold with disapproval. "I run a respectable establishment. Mr. Post, I don't tolerate this kind of behavior. I'll have to report this to the authorities. This is a clear case of seduction under false pretenses." This was the threat being introduced, not criminal charges against Edwin. He hadn't technically broken any laws, but the threat of publicity, of scandal, of Emily finding out, of society learning that he'd seduced a respectable woman with false promises. Edwin's panic was complete now. He was caught. There were witnesses. There was no way to deny what had happened. His mind immediately went to the consequences. Emily would divorce him, his family would be disgraced. His name would be dragged through newspapers. He would be ruined. "Please," he said. "There must be some way to resolve this privately." "I never meant to. I didn't know," she thought. Whitmore was pacing now, playing the role of a man torn between outrage and familial duty. "My sister's reputation has been destroyed. Mr. Post, she came to America seeking a better life. And now she's been compromised by a married man. How is she supposed to find a respectable husband now? How is she supposed to show her face in society?" The performance was brilliant. Every word designed to increase Edwin's guilt, to make him feel responsible for Margaret's supposed ruin. Mrs. Ashcroft added, "I must insist that something be done. I cannot have it said that such things happen under my roof without consequences." They let Edwin sit with this for a moment. Let the terror build. Let him imagine the scandal, the divorce, the social destruction. Then Whitmore, as if the thought had just occurred to him, said, "Unless perhaps there's a way to make this right, to compensate my sister for the damage to her reputation, to ensure her future is secure, despite your deception." This was the offer. The suggestion that money could make the problem disappear. It was presented not as extortion but as restitution. As the honorable thing to do, Edwin grasped at this lifeline immediately. "Yes, of course. Compensation, I can. How much would be appropriate?" Whitmore pretended to consider. "My sister's reputation is priceless, but I suppose, given the circumstances, $25,000 would allow her to leave New York. To start fresh somewhere her name isn't known, to rebuild her life." $25,000 was an enormous sum. Roughly $750,000 in today's currency, it represented nearly a year of Edwin's trust fund income. But to Edwin, terrified and desperate, it seemed like salvation. "I need some time to raise that amount. I don't keep that much liquid." "How much time?" Whitmore asked, his tone suspicious. a week, perhaps 10 days. I'll need to sell some stocks, arrange for a withdrawal from my trust. Whitmore appeared to consult with Margaret, who was still crying, playing the wounded innocent perfectly. Very well, you have 1 week. But Mr. Post, if you go to the authorities, if you try to avoid paying, if you tell anyone about this arrangement, I will ensure that every newspaper in New York knows what you did to my sister. Do you understand? Edwin understood perfectly. He was trapped, completely and inescapably trapped. He left the townhouse that night a broken man. He had been expertly manipulated, systematically compromised, and now he was being extorted. And the terrible thing was, he had no good options. If he paid, he would be bankrupt and vulnerable to future demands. If he refused, he would be exposed. His marriage would end. His social position would be destroyed. His family would be disgraced. The trap was perfect, and Edwin Post, like so many wealthy men before him, had walked into it willingly, seduced by his own weaknesses and the syndicate's sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this was just the beginning, that the $25,000 he was about to pay was merely the first extraction in what would become a systematic draining of his entire fortune. Because the beautiful thing about blackmail, from the criminal's perspective, is that it's renewable. Once you've paid once, you've admitted guilt, you've established that you're willing to pay us, become a permanent revenue source. And the syndicate had no intention of letting a mark as profitable as Edwin Post escape with a single payment. Edwin Post spent the 7 days after his entrapment in a state of barely controlled panic. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the looming deadline and the catastrophe he was trying to prevent. The isolation was crushing. He couldn't tell Emily, couldn't confide in friends, couldn't seek legal advice without risking the exact exposure he was paying to avoid. This isolation is a critical component of successful extortion. The victim must be alone, cut off from support systems, unable to seek advice or assistance, because advice from almost anyone would be the same. Don't pay. Go to the police, call their bluff. But calling their bluff required courage that Edwin didn't possess, and a willingness to accept consequences he couldn't bear to imagine. So he began the process of raising $25,000. Doing it in ways that wouldn't trigger questions from family or business associates, he sold $5,000 worth of railroad stock, telling his broker he was making a real estate investment. He borrowed $8,000 from a friend, claiming a temporary cash flow problem with his trust fund. He liquidated a collection of rare books his father had left him. He even pawned his mother's diamond cufflinks by April 3, 1899. He had assembled the full amount, mostly in cash, some in bearer bonds that could be easily converted. The handoff was arranged through an intermediary. He was instructed to bring the money to a lawyer's office on Pearl Street, a legitimate-seeming location that added a veneer of respectability to what was essentially a criminal transaction. The lawyer, a man named Samuel Richardson, who would later play a crucial role in defending the syndicate, took the money, counted it carefully, and provided Edwin with a signed receipt. The receipt read, "Received from Edwin M. Post. $25,000. In full settlement of all claims arising from incidents of March 26, 1899, this payment represents complete and final resolution. All parties agree to maintain absolute confidentiality regarding said incidents." Edwin took the receipt with shaking hands. He believed, desperately wanted to believe, that this was over, that he had paid for his mistake and could now return to his life. He was, of course, wrong. For exactly 3 weeks, Edwin experienced relief. He had paid. The problem was solved. He could breathe again. He was more careful now, avoiding gambling houses, coming home earlier, trying to be a better husband. Emily noticed the change, assumed he was finally growing up, taking his responsibilities seriously. She allowed herself to hope that their marriage might recover. Then, on April 25, 1899, Edwin received a letter at his club, hand-delivered by messenger. The letter was brief. "Mr. Post, I am a private investigator who has been retained to look into certain incidents that occurred on March 26th of this year. During my investigation, I discovered evidence of your involvement in compromising situations with a woman, not your wife. I have witness statements, corroborating testimony, and documentation that would be of great interest to your spouse and to society. I am prepared to sell this evidence to you for $10,000. Alternatively, I could provide it to other interested parties. You have 5 days to decide. A response can be sent to the address below." Edwin's hands trembled as he read the letter. This couldn't be happening. He had paid. He had a receipt, promising confidentiality, but here was someone else, claiming to have evidence demanding more money. What Edwin didn't understand, what the syndicate counted on victims not understanding, was that the receipt was meaningless. It had no legal force because the entire transaction was criminal, And even if it had been valid, this was a different person making a different claim. In reality, of course, it was the same network. The private investigator was another syndicate operative. This was the second extraction, planned from the beginning, using the first payment as proof that Edwin had something to hide. The logic was simple and devastating. If Edwin had been innocent, why had he paid $25,000? The fact that he'd paid proved he was guilty, which meant he'd pay again to keep that guilt hidden. Edwin tried to convince himself that this new threat was a bluff, that he could ignore it, but the terror was too great. What if this investigator really did have evidence? What if he really would tell Emily? After 3 days of agony, Edwin paid again, $10,000, delivered to a different address, received by a different intermediary. This time there was no receipt, no promise of confidentiality, just the money changing hands and Edwin walking away. Feeling sick and violated, but believing he had no choice, the pattern was established. Over the next 18 months, Edwin Post paid 6 more times, different people, different threats, different amounts, but always the same core leverage. "We have evidence of what you did. Pay us or we'll expose you." The demands came every 6 to 8 weeks, carefully spaced to give Edwin time to recover financially between extractions. The syndicate was managing their asset, making sure they could extract maximum value without completely destroying him. The amounts varied: $8,000, $12,000, $15,000, $7,000. Each payment calibrated to what Rothstein's analysis suggested Edwin could raise without triggering bankruptcy. By November 1900, Edwin had paid a total of $73,000, roughly $2.2 million in today's currency. He had bankrupted himself, borrowed from friends under false pretenses, sold family heirlooms, pawned jewelry, liquidated nearly every asset he controlled. His trust fund was depleted. He had taken advances against future income. He was in debt to multiple creditors. His financial situation was desperate, and still the demands kept coming. In December 1900, Edwin received another letter, this one demanding $20,000, more than he'd paid in any single extraction. He didn't have it, couldn't raise it, had nothing left to sell or borrow against. For the first time since this nightmare began, Edwin was forced to confront the reality that he couldn't keep paying, that this would never end unless he made it end. This is when victims typically break. When they run out of resources, they have to make a choice: continue hiding and face complete financial ruin, or confess and face social ruin. Edwin chose confession, not because he wanted to, not because he'd found courage, but because he literally had no other option. On December 15th, 1900, he told Emily everything. They were in the parlor of their home on East 61st Street. Edwin had been drinking for courage. Emily was working on correspondence. It was an ordinary evening until Edwin said, "I need to tell you something terrible." Emily looked up from her letters, saw his face, and immediately knew this was serious. What followed was 3 hours of confession. Edwin told her about the gambling, about Marie Laurent, about the trap at the townhouse, about the first payment, about all the subsequent payments, about being bled dry over 18 months. Emily's reaction was documented in letters she wrote to her sister over the following weeks. These letters were eventually donated to the New York Historical Society and provide devastating insight into her emotional state. "I felt as though the floor had opened beneath me," she wrote, not because of Edwin's initial betrayal, though that was devastating enough. Adultery is almost commonplace among our set, but because of the sheer scope of the deception, $73,000, 18 months of systematic lies, every time he said he was going to the club or meeting business associates, he was actually arranging to pay blackmailers. Our entire life together had become a fiction constructed to hide his shame. But Emily was also furious. And not just at Edwin, she was angry at the criminals who had destroyed their lives. At a system that made wealthy men such easy targets. At a society that valued reputation so highly that people would bankrupt themselves to protect it. "These people are parasites," she wrote. "They've built an entire business around exploiting men's weaknesses. And they're allowed to operate openly because their victims are too ashamed to report them. Someone needs to stop them. Someone needs to expose this entire rotten system." Emily convinced Edwin to go to the police, to file a formal complaint, to stop paying and start fighting. This was unusual. Most victims never reported extortion. The shame was too great, the risk of exposure too high. Revealing that you'd been blackmailed meant revealing why you'd been blackmailed, which meant admitting to adultery, gambling, whatever secret you'd been protecting. But Emily understood something crucial. The extortionists had power only as long as their victims valued reputation more than justice. "We've already lost the money," she told Edwin. "Our marriage is already destroyed at this point. The only question is whether we let them win completely or whether we fight back." In January 1901, Edwin Post filed a complaint with the New York Police Department. He provided names, addresses, dates, copies of receipts, a complete record of every payment. The police assigned the case to Detective William Flynn, a 42-year-old career officer who specialized in confidence crimes and extortion. Flynn was unusual among New York police. He was honest, which in an era of rampant corruption made him almost unique. He couldn't be bribed, couldn't be intimidated, and he was very, very good at his job. What Flynn discovered during his investigation would expose not just one criminal operation, but an entire industry. Detective Flynn's investigation into Edwin Post's extortion revealed a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't a handful of criminals working in isolation. It was an organized system with structure, specialization, and reach, extending throughout New York's wealthiest circles. Flynn began by following the money. The receipts and payment records Edwin provided offered a trail. Each payment had gone to different addresses, different intermediaries, but Flynn suspected they were all connected. He spent 3 months tracking down the people who'd received Edwin's payments. Some were lawyers, some were businessmen, some operated from offices, others from rented rooms. But careful investigation revealed that money from all of them eventually flowed to the same places. Flynn identified at least 37 other victims who had been targeted by the same network, wealthy men all caught in similar traps. All paying regularly, all too ashamed to report. He found a banker who'd paid $42,000 over 2 years, a shipping magnate who'd paid $38,000, a railroad executive who'd paid $55,000, a politician who'd paid $67,000. The total extracted from these victims exceeded $2 million, roughly $60 million in today's currency over a period of 7 years. This was not crime, this was industry. Operating with the scale and efficiency of any legitimate business, Flynn began mapping the organization, interviewing victims, following money trails, surveilling suspects, and what he found was remarkable in its complexity. At the top were the financiers, wealthy men who provided startup capital and received a percentage of all extractions. These weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were businessmen treating extortion as an investment opportunity. Flynn identified at least 5 financiers, including Harrison Bradley, vice president of the Hudson Trust Company, a bank that served many of New York's wealthiest families. Bradley had invested $50,000 in the extortion network. In 1897, the money was used to purchase properties like the townhouse on East 23rd Street, to hire operatives to bribe police and officials, to establish the infrastructure needed for systematic operations. By 1901, Bradley had received over $200,000 in returns, a 400% profit in 4 years, better returns than almost any legitimate investment could provide. Below the financiers were the organizers, people like Charles Mortimer, who ran the gambling houses, and Abraham Rothstein, who maintained the book and planned operations. Mortimer's role was crucial. He provided legitimate cover. The Saratoga Club appeared to be just a gambling establishment, but it was actually a hunting ground where victims were identified and initial contact was made. Rothstein was the strategic genius. He analyzed targets, identified vulnerabilities, designed operations specifically calibrated to each victim's weaknesses. He was essentially running an intelligence operation, gathering information, planning campaigns, measuring results. Then came the lures, women like Margaret Lawson, who created the compromising situations. Flynn discovered that the syndicate employed at least 12 women in this role, each with different physical types and personas, allowing them to target victims with varying preferences. These women were professionals, trained in psychology and seduction, paid handsomely for successful operations. Margaret Lawson earned approximately $5,000 per successful extortion, plus bonuses if the victim paid multiple times. Supporting them were the actors, people who played various roles in the traps. Flynn identified a core group of 8 men and 4 women who regularly appeared as outraged brothers, scandalized landladies, concerned doctors, sympathetic friends, whatever role the script required. Thomas Whitmore, who'd played Margaret's brother in Edwin's trap, had performed in at least 23 different operations, playing different characters but always the same basic role. The person whose outrage created the crisis that money could resolve. Next were the collectors, the people who delivered threats and received payments. These were often lawyers like Samuel Richardson, men who appeared respectable and could provide veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially organized crime. Richardson represented the syndicate in multiple capacities. He drafted the fake settlement agreements that victims received. He provided legal advice to operatives. He negotiated when victims tried to reduce payments, and perhaps most importantly, he would later defend syndicate members when they were arrested. Finally, there were the enforcers, used only when victims refused to pay or threatened to go to the police. Flynn found evidence of at least 6 cases where enforcement had been necessary. In one case, a victim who refused to pay had found his business mysteriously audited by tax authorities who discovered irregularities. In another case, a victim who threatened to go to the police had his daughter's engagement broken off after her fiancé's family received anonymous letters detailing her father's indiscretions. The enforcers didn't typically use physical violence. The threat of exposure was usually enough, but they had connections throughout New York's power structure. To newspapers, to government officials, to social gatekeepers. They could destroy reputations with a whisper campaign. The entire operation was designed around one fundamental insight. Wealthy men will pay extraordinary sums to protect their reputations, and their fear can be systematically exploited for profit. But what shocked Flynn most wasn't the organization's structure, it was its reach. The syndicate had connections to Tammany Hall, New York's political machine, that police captains were receiving monthly payments to ignore complaints that judges were sometimes investors in the operations, that some of the most respectable names in New York society were involved. The book that Rothstein maintained wasn't just a list of victims, it was also a list of protectors, police officers, politicians, judges, journalists. Anyone who might threaten the operation was either bought off or compromised. Flynn realized he was investigating not just a criminal enterprise, but a system that had embedded itself deeply into New York's power structure. He knew that making arrests would trigger a response, that powerful people would try to protect their investment, that evidence might disappear, witnesses might recant, his own career might be threatened. But Flynn was committed to justice, and he believed that Edwin Post's courage in coming forward deserved to be matched with courage from law enforcement. In March 1901, Flynn was ready to move. He had assembled evidence against dozens of operatives. He had testimony from multiple victims. He had financial records proving the flow of money. He raided the Saratoga Club first, arriving with 12 officers. They found the book, Rothstein's Ledger of Victims, along with detailed financial records showing how profits were distributed. The book contained over 200 entries, names, amounts paid, vulnerabilities exploited. It was a comprehensive record of 7 years of systematic extortion. Flynn arrested Charles Mortimer on the spot. Then he arrested Margaret Lawson, who was living in an apartment on West 38th Street, paid for with her earnings from destroying wealthy men's lives. She initially refused to cooperate, but when Flynn threatened her with charges that could result in 20 years in prison, she began to talk. Her testimony was devastating. She described how the operations worked, how marks were selected, how traps were set, how payments were extracted and distributed. She named Thomas Whitmore, Mrs. Florence Ashcroft, Samuel Richardson, dozens of others. Over the next 6 months, Flynn made 32 arrests. He seized records documenting hundreds of extortions. He uncovered bank accounts holding over $400,000 in extorted funds. And he discovered the financiers, including Harrison Bradley. When Flynn arrived at Bradley's office with an arrest warrant, the banker was genuinely shocked. He had believed himself insulated from prosecution, protected by his connections and his respectability. "This is absurd," Bradley said. "I'm a businessman. I've committed no crime. You invested in an extortion network," Flynn said. "You profited from the systematic destruction of people's lives. That's a crime, Mr. Bradley, regardless of how respectable you believe yourself to be." Bradley's arrest sent shockwaves through New York society. He wasn't some street criminal. He was a vice president at a major bank, a member of exclusive clubs, a man who dined with mayors and governors, and he had been financing extortion operations. The scandal exploded beyond the criminal courts and into New York's highest social circles. Newspapers covered it extensively. Society magazines discussed it in scandalized tones. The very people who had been paying extortionists were now confronted with evidence of how widespread the industry had become. But as the trial approached, Flynn began to see evidence of the system protecting itself. The trial of Charles Mortimer and his co-conspirators began in September 1901, and it immediately became clear that this would not be a straightforward prosecution. The defense strategy, coordinated by Samuel Richardson, was brilliant and ruthless. They would put the victims on trial. Richardson argued that there had been no extortion, merely breach of promise suits settled privately. He claimed that men, like Edwin Post, had made promises to women like Margaret Lawson, promises of marriage or financial support, then broken those promises. The payments weren't extortion, Richardson argued. They were compensation for broken hearts and damaged reputations. This strategy forced prosecutors to prove that the encounters were entrapments rather than consensual relationships, which meant putting the victims on the stand and making them describe in explicit detail what had happened. For men like Edwin Post, this was almost worse than the original extortion. They had to publicly admit to adultery, to betraying their wives, to Being drunk and reckless, everything they'd paid to keep private was now being aired in open court. Many victims refused to testify. They'd rather let the criminals go free than face public humiliation. The shame was too great, the social cost too high. But Edwin Post did testify. Emily had convinced him that this was necessary, that if these criminals weren't stopped, they would continue destroying families. His testimony was excruciating. He had to describe meeting Margaret, going to the townhouse, the compromising situation. His terror when Whitmore burst in. Richardson cross-examined him brutally. "Mr. Post, you went to this address voluntarily, is that correct?" "Yes." "But you drank wine with Miss Lawson?" "Yes." "You engaged in intimate behavior with her?" "I was deceived, she was, so you claim. Or, perhaps, Mr. Post, you simply regret your choices and are now trying to blame others for your own moral failings." This went on for 3 days, Richardson systematically destroying Edwin's credibility, painting him as an adulterer trying to avoid consequences. The jury, composed entirely of men who likely had similar secrets, was sympathetic to this narrative. Other victims testified, each describing similar traps, similar payments, similar ongoing extortion. But Richardson managed to reframe each case. These weren't victims, he suggested. They were wealthy men caught in their own lies, trying to criminalize the consequences of their behavior. Margaret Lawson's testimony should have been more damaging to the defense. She admitted to being paid, admitted the encounters were orchestrated, admitted there was a network, but Richardson managed to reframe even this. He suggested she was a woman scorned, that she'd genuinely cared for these men and been abandoned, that she was cooperating with prosecutors out of revenge rather than conscience. Miss Lawson, Richardson said during cross-examination, "You claim you were paid to seduce these men, but isn't it true that you developed genuine feelings for some of them, that you hoped for more than just financial transactions?" It was a masterful manipulation, turning a professional criminal into a romantic figure. But beyond Richardson's courtroom brilliance, something else was happening. Evidence was disappearing. Witnesses were becoming unavailable. Powerful people wanted this trial to end. Several of the men named in the book were connected to Tammany Hall, 2 banks, 2 corporations that had influence over judges and politicians. Flynn found that crucial evidence he'd seized during the raids was missing from the evidence room. Pages from the book had been removed. Financial records had vanished. Witnesses who'd agreed to testify suddenly claimed they couldn't remember details or left the city entirely. The judge, Martin Prescott, made rulings that consistently favored the defense, excluding evidence, limiting testimony, creating procedural obstacles for the prosecution. Flynn suspected Prescott had been compromised, either through bribery or through his own secrets being threatened, but he couldn't prove it. The most egregious example of the system protecting itself was the case of Harrison Bradley. The banker who'd financed the operation. Bradley's arrest had been announced. Charges had been filed, but his case was separated from the main trial, delayed indefinitely due to procedural complications. Then, mysteriously, the evidence against Bradley disappeared, the financial records proving his investment, the testimony linking him to the syndicate. All of it vanished from the prosecutor's files. Without evidence, charges were dropped. Bradley returned to his position at Hudson Trust, his reputation barely scratched. Years later, Flynn would discover that Bradley had paid $50,000 to make his case disappear. Ironically, using the same financial leverage he'd used to invest in the syndicate to protect himself from prosecution for that investment. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and as it progressed, it became clear that the syndicate would not be dismantled, only wounded. In November 1901, the jury returned its verdict. Charles Mortimer was convicted on 5 counts of extortion and sentenced to 7 years in Sing Sing prison. Thomas Whitmore was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 4 years. Margaret Lawson was convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to 3 years. Mrs. Florence Ashcroft was convicted on 1 count and sentenced to 18 months. For other operatives, received sentences ranging from 1 to 3 years, but most of the network walked free. The financiers were never prosecuted. The lawyers who'd served as intermediaries claimed attorney-client privilege. The police officers who'd been paid off were never charged. Abraham Rothstein, the strategic genius who'd planned operations, was never even arrested by the time Flynn had enough evidence to bring charges. Rothstein had disappeared, rumored to have fled to Europe with a substantial portion of the syndicate's profits. The system had protected itself. Powerful people had ensured that only the expendable operatives faced consequences. The real architects of the extortion industry remained untouched, and the victims, men like Edwin Post, were left to deal with the aftermath of their public humiliation. Edwin's testimony had made him infamous. His name appeared in newspapers across the country. always in the context of adultery and extortion, he became a cautionary tale, a joke at dinner parties,